Okay,
Just to show
okay,
support,
sorry.
nothing else.
Can you not, film a video that's being shown of the accident? I can't force you to, but I can certainly ask. I would never do it. Well, it's in respect to the concern that they don't see you.
Yeah, because I know we wouldn't show, other than like the beginning part of it, but then we.
Justice is slow.
Yeah, there's a.
Pardon me?
I said she put in the paper, let me just verify, because she was asking that question.
Okay.
I don't think. Nowadays, things have changed, but we show all that.
No, so you should. Okay, thank you very much. Well, all the witnesses are gonna be in that witness box. Might be one. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Circuit Court is now in session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody ready to go? Mr. Chair?
We are, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Spadero,
Yes, Your Honor.
today is the sentencing hearing for Mongan Vaughn, State of Florida versus Mongan Vaughn, charged with vehicular homicide ×2, reckless driving with serious bodily injury, another reckless driving with serious bodily injury, and a third reckless driving with serious bodily injury. Mr. Mongan pled, I don't know how, 6 weeks ago?
Correct, March 8th.
March 8th, guilty to all the charges. the parameters, the understanding of his plea agreement, which will be what I have to do, because that is the understanding of the plea agreement, which I approved, is the bottom is what, 26 and some months?
26.6, Your Honor.
26.6 months.
No, years.
I meant to say years, no worries, to a 40-year cap. So those are the parameters I'm going to be dealing with, and each side is going to present whatever evidence they think is relevant and persuasive in that regard. Okay.
So Judge, with that then, the defense would go ahead and call Justin Morgan, who is our expert in reference to human factors. He is present in the room behind us to the wall.
Your Honor, before we do that, I just wanted to clarify for the record, 26.13125 years. I
Okay.
apologize.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Good afternoon, Mr. Morgan. Morgan, that's right, correct?
Yes, Judge.
And for the record, could you state your full legal name?
Yes, sir. My name is Justin Fox Morgan.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a human factors scientist,
And what are your areas of expertise?
specifically human factors and traffic safety.
What exactly are human factors?
Human factors is a scientific discipline that seeks to understand human capabilities and limitations with respect to how we interact with the environment. In the case of traffic safety, that's about understanding the relationship between a driver, their vehicle, and the roadway environment.
And were you retained by my office as an expert in this matter?
Yes, sir, I was.
And are you here today to testify as an expert in human factors regarding your evaluation of the accident?
I am.
Could you please tell the court what your educational background is?
Have a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, master's in modeling and simulation from the University of Central Florida, and a doctorate in applied experimental and human factors psychology, also from the University of Central Florida.
Could you please describe your work experience as it relates to human factors?
Yes, sir. So after finishing my doctoral work, I was a faculty member at Virginia Tech, specifically at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. I did research and development work primarily for the US DOT, but also vehicle manufacturers and suppliers. After my time there, I was with the Patel Memorial Institute in Seattle, Washington, doing very similar R&D work. And then in mid-2015, I joined a forensics firm and have been practicing forensic human factors since.
And could you tell the court what exactly is an ACTAR?
Yes, sir. I'm an ACTAR accredited accident reconstructionist. So that's the Accreditation Commission for Traffic Accident Reconstruction. It's an independent accrediting body for individuals in the reconstruction community. It's open to both law enforcement as well as the private individuals such as myself.
And how does one earn accreditation in that field?
To earn that, you submit your qualifications to a board of governors. After review, you're accepted and allowed to sit for 2 4-hour exams, one of which covers theory of reconstruction. The other is a practical exercise of reconstructing a vehicle collision. After passing those exams, you then maintain your education through 80 hours of continuing education over every 5-year period.
Do you have, in addition to that, any specialized training in analyzing what we commonly refer to as EDR, event data recordings?
Yes, sir. I've taken coursework specifically in analyzing EDR or black box data from vehicles.
And are you a member of any professional societies related to human factors or transportation, for that matter?
Yes, sir. I'm a full member of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of SAE International, which used to be the Society of Automotive Engineers, as well as a friend of multiple committees of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies.
Your CV has multiple publications that you've offered. More specifically, what discipline within the field of human factors have you authored in terms of papers or articles written?
There's a couple of exceptions, but the majority of my work is in the field of traffic safety.
And have you been qualified as an expert in accident reconstruction and human factors?
Yes, sir, in both state and federal courts.
Okay. And in reference to this matter, could you tell me when you were retained, what were you asked to do by my office?
Initially, I was asked to review the work and the reconstruction that was performed in this matter. Then later, I was asked to attempt to analyze it and provide a bit more context to how the collision developed and unfolded.
And what exactly for your evaluation are you relying on upon your testimony here today when you're performing your analysis of the collision?
So I have the analysis and reconstruction that Master Corporal Hinton performed in this matter. I have the documentation from that, the EDR or black box data from the Tesla, as well as site measurements.
And in reviewing that, do you have any question at all in reference to Master Corporal Hinton's work?
No, sir. So in reviewing Master Corporal Hinton's work, it's reliable and a sound analysis.
Do you have any question as it pertains to the Tesla EDR information that was gathered from the crash?
No, sir. I've reviewed it, and there's no reason to question its validity either.
Can you describe the crash events as recorded by the Tesla EDR?
Yes, sir. So the black box or EDR of the Tesla recorded two separate events. The first is consistent with impact to the embankment. The second is consistent with impact to the building.
So if I understand you correctly, is there two EDR events?
Yes, sir.
And the first one is involving the embankment?
Yes, sir. And that would be the first sequentially.
And the second one then, by virtue of number two, is the house?
That's correct.
And as far as the Tesla EDR reported a max speed of 124 miles an hour, do you know if that was the fastest the vehicle had gone?
There's an indication that it would not have been.
And in terms of how do you know that?
So there's a couple of things that help us understand that. To begin with, the data limitations described in the Tesla EDR or black box report tell us that the EDR simply reports a maximum of 124 miles per hour. So beyond that, it will simply report the same speed, 124. The other way is by reviewing the data. We have a couple of timestamps within the Event 1 EDR, and that shows the vehicle is slowing down at that point in time, yet it reports the same speed twice. So that tells us that the vehicle did likely exceed 124 miles per hour.
Okay. Is it possible then to determine the Tesla's maximum speed during the event?
It's possible to come up with an estimate of it and to review the data and extrapolate and come up with an estimate. It's not going to be the most precise number, but it is possible.
So when you have an EDR event, which is captured then by the black box, so to speak, by Tesla, correct? I mean, do all vehicles these days have black boxes or EDRs?
Approximately 95 to 97% of the vehicles on the market have such black boxes.
And prior to that EDR event then, is it possible to determine what the vehicle's speed was prior to the EDR event?
In this case, given that we know where the vehicle started from and the nature of its acceleration, we can come up with an estimate of where, of the characterization of its run to reach where we first see data recorded by the Tesla. So we can, in effect, extrapolate back and see what that vehicle was doing at the beginning of its run.
So if we're talking about an estimated representation, I assume it would be the better word would be fair. What would that calculation be for in terms of the value to use for speed?
So ultimately, in terms of looking at the potential maximum speed that this vehicle reached, My analysis ultimately agrees with Master Corporal Hinton's that it should be between about 116 and 129 miles per hour. Now, in that, just for simplicity's sake of analysis, I'm using the maximum of 124 miles per hour.
And as you're sitting here today, in terms of, can you describe how the accident occurred? Would it be something easy for you to use in terms of in your presentation, such as a slide?
Yes, sir.
And would you need that queued up at this point in time and able to see what you're talking about? So we
Please.
can explain it. If you could. Slide 2, please. And
Are you putting these in evidence, or?
no, Judge, we're using
Okay.
this simply for him to go ahead and take a look at and give testimony to. Could you describe, is this in fact slide 2?
Yes, sir, it is.
And what is that showing?
So this shows the area where this initial run and then the collision event unfolded. And so what we see is Manning Drive, which is actually this is the third slide, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Could we go back 2, please?
Yes, so this is an overall aerial of the site. This shows Manning Drive in between Canopy Oaks Boulevard and Hermosa Drive. And we can see that Manning is a relatively long and straight road.
And does it appear to separate that road between 2 subdivisions on either side?
Yes, sir, it does.
And does it end in a T section at Hermosa?
Yes, sir, the northern end of Manning does terminate there at Hermosa Drive.
And if we go to slide 3, if we could.
Yes, sir, this is slide 3.
What we see here as shown on the screen appears to be a yellow arrow. Is that the beginning of the vehicle's acceleration?
Yes, sir, the lower arrow would be the beginning of the acceleration event. The top yellow arrow would be where the initial EDR event 1, so the first collision event recorded by the black box on the Tesla was, and just showing that the total distance between that is just over, 1,649 feet in total.
So what we're looking at, if I understand then correctly, would be simply the start through the acceleration, through the braking until the impact on the first EDR?
That's correct.
And that distance then is the one that's listed?
That's correct. So that distance in total, 1,649 feet, which is a little bit different than what's reported in the THI report. However, the THI report measures to the stop sign. This goes beyond that to the first impact. So therefore, it's a little bit longer distance.
Okay. And is it my understanding that the Tesla EDR captured that whole event from beginning to end?
No, sir, it only captured the last 5 seconds leading up to the first impact.
You could explain that.
Yes, if we could go to the next slide, please. So here on the left side of the screen, you see the data from the Tesla black box report. Just one section of it that shows us in the far left column a timestamp that leads down to, or acts as a countdown to the impact. And then the next column to the right being the vehicle's reported speed in miles per hour. So what it shows us is we have a total of 5 seconds before that first impact where we have data describing exactly what the vehicle was doing.
And when we're talking about the distance that the Tesla was covering in that 5-second block that was recorded by the EDR, can we figure that out?
Yes, sir, we can.
And how do you figure that out?
So I've shown this on screen. We have if we just take that same data set, turn miles per hour into feet per second, and then understanding how fast the vehicle's moving in each of those time bins, we can then determine how far the vehicle moved in each time bin, and understanding impact would be 0 feet, then just add it back. And that shows us that at the beginning of that 5-second period, the vehicle was approximately 774 feet back from the first impact.
From the first impact of the embankment?
Yes, sir.
So when the EDR captures it, is that capturing a braking event, or is that simply capturing whatever's happening during that 5-second period?
So an EDR or black box has a constant stream of data running through it, and as soon as there's an event that the car or the airbag control system senses as being noteworthy or potentially relevant to an airbag event, then it freezes the period of data going back preceding that event. So here, there's a running stream of data through the car's black box. It senses the collision event and then freezes the previous 5 seconds of data. So we have what the vehicle was recording for 5 seconds before the first impact.
And do you have, in terms of the, I guess it would be a diagram or slide in reference that shows what we just talked about?
Yes, sir, if we could go to the next slide.
So this would be considered slide 5,
Yes, sir.
if I understand correctly. If you could explain to the court what exactly the court is looking at here.
So now that we can calculate where the Tesla was 5 seconds before impact, that's shown in red on this diagram. So with the entirety of the travel path originally shown in green, the segment shown in red relates to EDR event 1. So basically that is the portion of this event where the Tesla, where we have data reflected in EDR event 1.
So where was the Tesla then on Manning Road when it was the 5 seconds out?
So it would be 774 feet back from the embankment, and that would be in the area where the line transitions from green to red in this image.
And if I understand that, then how much of the distance between acceleration and the first impact then is left to explain to the court?
So ultimately, that would leave the green portion. So we know that the total distance is 1,649 feet. We have data that talks to us about 774 feet, so that leaves 875 feet to explain.
And that 875 is what exactly for the court to understand you more clearly?
So that would be the portion of time between the beginning of the acceleration event and where EDR event 1 picks up and starts describing what the vehicle was doing.
So are we talking then a number of feet of acceleration of 875 before the EDR event occurred?
We can't necessarily call it all acceleration, but it's, if you wanted to term it, that's the phase that led up to the car reaching its maximum speed. And then EDR event 1 shows us the car was braking for the 5 seconds before impact a little bit more. So we have an acceleration phase and then the braking phase in effect.
If we go to slide 6, could you explain slide 6 to the court? And what it appears to show is the Tesla reaching 124 miles an hour. How long would it take as far as for it to reach the 124 miles an hour?
So ultimately, we know that the Tesla started from a stop. We know that it reached a maximum speed of approximately 124 miles per hour. And we know the distance that it took to do that maneuver, that run. So that allows us to calculate how long it would take the car to do it. And I've got the math shown on screen here, but ultimately from 0 to 124 miles per hour would be about 9.6 seconds total.
And when we're talking in terms of that type of acceleration, what kind of, is there, in terms of explaining to the court the G-forces, what exactly does that mean when you're talking about either acceleration or de-acceleration?
So ultimately, since we now can characterize the acceleration maneuver of the Tesla, we can also calculate that it accelerated on average at 0.6 G. And so 0.6 G doesn't really mean a lot to us without some context, but ultimately, braking and acceleration are both acceleration events. So whether you're pressing the gas pedal of your car or whether you're pressing the brake pedal of the car, you're experiencing acceleration. But we've been we're unlikely to ever experience 0.6 G acceleration, whereas we may have experienced 0.6 G braking. If you brake at 0.6 G, you're going to be pitched forward in your seat belt's likely to lock. If you have a book in the seat, your passenger seat of your vehicle, it's likely to be thrown forward and will be in the floorboard of your car. Not too long ago in the accident reconstruction world, we treated 0.7 G as the maximum braking for a car that was possible. So 0.6 G acceleration is something that's quite tremendous.
And with that understanding then, can you explain in terms of by walking us through the entire event with the information you just provided us?
Yes, sir. So if we go to the next slide, please.
Slide 7, please.
So now that we have the entirety of the event calculated, we know that the vehicle started from a stop at Canopy Oaks Boulevard. It accelerated from a stop to 124 miles per hour in 9.6 seconds approximately at a 0.6 G average acceleration. Then the EDR data tell us that the vehicle was braking for approximately 774 feet, or just over 5 seconds before that first impact with the embankment.
So does that mean when it's braking, a person is letting off the accelerator in order to hit the brake to cause it to brake?
So ultimately, what we know from the EDR data is that there is at least 5 seconds of braking. The video shows us there's a little bit more than that, about 5.3 seconds of braking before impact.
So if I understand correctly, then he's on the brake at 5.3 seconds before the first event, which is hitting the embankment.
That's correct.
Can you put the Tesla, which is it simply an electronic car in terms of a vehicle? There's no hybrid to it, so to speak?
That's correct. This is pure what's called a battery electric vehicle. There's no internal combustion engine like we had for the last 100 years.
And if we go to slide 8, could you, in terms of compare what a Tesla's acceleration is to I guess it would be a mechanically combustion type engine?
If we could go to the next slide, please.
Slide 9,
Yes, sir.
go ahead.
So what I've put up is just, this is a typical power response curve for an internal combustion engine. That's typically acronymed ICE, or internal combustion engine. This is what most of us are used to. You see that we're primarily interested in torque. Torque is the main metric of what we sense when we're being pressed back in the seat by an accelerating vehicle. And as you see here, an engine has to start spinning faster to generate its maximum torque. That's in comparison to an electric motor, which if we could go to the next slide, please. Again, calling out torque, an electric motor produces maximum torque at 0 RPM. So as soon as the motor starts turning, it's producing its maximum torque, which is why performance electric vehicles have such intense acceleration.
So is there a difference between a gas combustion drivetrain and an electric drivetrain per se?
As far as the acceleration characteristics, the electric drivetrain is able to generate maximum acceleration almost instantaneously.
And for example, in a mechanical combustion engine where you have a transmission and you feel the gears changing, does that happen in an electric car?
It depends on the car. In this case, there's no transmission per se. It's a direct drive, so all you'll feel is just a solid wave of acceleration.
So what kind of power then, if we're talking about the Tesla Plaid S, so that's a specific car made by Tesla, if I understand, and there's different variants of the Tesla. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And are you familiar with the different versions?
In general.
Okay. Is the Tesla Plaid S their top of the line car in terms of when it comes to, in terms of engines, speed, acceleration?
Yes, sir. The Model S Plaid is their highest performance model at that time.
And if I were to show you the next slide, should show the Tesla. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes, sir. This is a Tesla marketing image, but it basically shows the power delivery of the Model S Plaid and shows that this vehicle makes over 1,000 horsepower.
And for example, for some of us that may not be into cars, could you explain what that compares to relatively, for example, for like a Toyota?
The Toyota Camry that I drove here today in produces about 200 horsepower. In comparison, Audi R8, which is a Audi supercar, produces about 600 horsepower from a V10 engine.
Is it possible for you to compare the power of the Tesla to the power of the Audi R8?
Yes, sir. So if you'll go to the next slide. This is the Audi R8. This is Audi's Halo supercar. And this is just an image of it from Audi's website to help us all understand the vehicle we're looking at and talking about. Again, this is Audi's Halo supercar, but if you'll go to the next slide, please. I was able to locate an instrumented test conducted by Car and Driver, and as part of that testing, they did a measured run of that vehicle from 0 to 130 miles per hour. And from that, I was able to characterize the acceleration of the vehicle.
And when you characterize the acceleration of the vehicle, if you could state it, what do you mean by that?
So ultimately, what we're interested in is what kind of acceleration does this vehicle generate for a very high-speed run? So accelerating from a stop up to, for instance, ultimately 124 miles per hour, what is this vehicle able to do? So here, since we know the vehicle started from a stop, accelerated to 130 miles per hour, then ultimately we know that the vehicle took about 12 and a half seconds to do that and was accelerating at an average of 0.47 G.
And that .47, is that the Tesla or is that the Audi?
That's the Audi.
Okay.
Now that we have that data, we can compare it to what the Tesla did.
And how does it compare?
So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So ultimately, we know that now that we know the acceleration characteristics of Audi's supercar, we can calculate what it would take for that vehicle to reach 124 miles per hour. The Audi R8 would take 11.9 seconds to reach 124 miles an hour, or just under 1,100 feet. So compared to what the Tesla did, it would need about 21% more distance and time to do the same maneuver.
And when you're comparing this and you're talking about Car and Driver, do you know where they usually conduct their, in terms of tests? Is it on the street or is it on the strip?
They state that their testing is performed on closed course test tracks. So it would be ideal conditions to generate the best performance out of a vehicle.
So the vehicle that Mr. Mangan was driving that night, in terms of the Tesla for the first time, how does that compare to, you know, a supercar on a public street?
It outperformed the performance of the Audi R8 and did so on a public street.
So let me ask you this. When a person is going that fast down the road, at some point in time, if a person glances down or looks at the speedometer, could you explain to the court what happens when a person does that and takes their eyes off the road?
Yes, sir. So using some published data for what typical eye glance durations are, that is basically how long you spend looking at different things inside your car, I was able to then calculate how far at 124 miles per hour you would be going with each of those types of glances. And so if you'll go to the next slide, please. So for a simple glance to the instrument cluster, that is if you're looking at your speedometer, those glances are about 0.7 seconds, roughly 0.68 seconds. But if you're traveling 124 miles per hour, just due to the speed alone, you would travel 41 yards during that time. So just under half a football field in a single glance to your speedometer at this type of speed.
So given the fact that the Tesla has theoretically or realistically reached 124 miles an hour in well under 10 seconds, what would someone that has never had that experience with this level of acceleration, because it's an electric car, which is, if I understand correctly, totally over and above a mechanical combustion engine, correct?
That's correct.
So would a person who's never driven one be prepared for that or not, in your opinion?
Not necessarily. It's just a level of acceleration that, frankly, it's unlikely any of us have experienced before. And so, in effect, this car started from a stop and accelerated to from a stop to at least 124 miles per hour, and did so in less time than it's taking me to say that sentence. So, it's just an amazing level of acceleration.
Was there ever time in looking at the EDR in terms of data that you were able to see whether or not Mr. Mangan attempted to try to control that vehicle?
There is an indication of that in EDR Event 1, so that first EDR record associated with impact with the embankment. We'll go to the next slide, please. So what the EDR data tell us is that Mr. Mongan was off of the accelerator pedal for the entirety of EDR event 1. So there's not an attempt to keep accelerating during that time, and it shows us that the basically the throttle or accelerator pedal was not being pressed. And if you'll move to the next slide, please. Also, in looking at the braking that's recorded by the Tesla for EDR event 1, it shows us that the brake pedal was being depressed for the entirety of event 1. And going back and reviewing the video, we know that it was, in fact, just a fraction of a second longer than 5 seconds of an attempt to brake this car and regain control. We also see that besides the brake being active for the entirety of EDR event 1, we see that stability control is active, and we also see a brief engagement of ABS during that braking event.
So if you could explain ABS to the court for those that may not understand exactly what ABS stands for.
And I apologize, I realize I've used an abbreviation there, but anti-lock braking system, it's something that helps keep your tires from locking up as you're braking and helps you basically maintain control during a braking event.
So is it fair to say then, Mr. Mongan recognized the fact that the end of the road was coming up and attempted to brake and let off the accelerator and attempt to stop the vehicle?
The data in EDR event 1 is consistent with that.
Okay. And is that consistent then with being off the throttle for the 5 seconds?
Yes, sir, it is.
Is that consistent then with being on the brakes for at least 5 seconds?
It is.
When you were describing the braking, can you, in terms of enlighten the court in reference to the type of braking that occurs normally in these kind of conditions? For example, on the initial, in terms of where you get this EDR event and it goes back 5 seconds, explain to the court as far as you see a braking, but is it a panic brake or is it a tap on the brake?
So ultimately, this is not something we would characterize as panic braking in the beginning, but that is frankly unsurprising given the maneuver that the vehicle just underwent.
And when you say maneuver this vehicle underwent, what do you mean by that?
Basically the run from 0 to over 100 miles per hour in under 10 seconds.
And is your opinion then about how this accident occurred within a reasonable degree of scientific probability based on your training and experience?
Yes, sir, it is.
I have no further questions.
Yes, Your Honor. Assistant State Attorney Alec Wade for the record. Good afternoon, Dr. Morgan.
Good afternoon.
I want to pick up where Mr. Terex just sort of left off with regards to the braking. When you're looking at that particular set from the electronic or the event data recorder, under service brake when it says on, does that give you any indication whatsoever with regards to how hard the defendant might have had his foot on the brake?
So briefly, the answer is no, not in this portion of the EDR record. We have to go to a different section of the EDR to be able to describe how hard the braking event is.
Okay. And is that section of the EDR, one moment. Is the longitudinal acceleration relevant to making that determination?
Yes, sir.
Did you look at the longitudinal acceleration and analyze that in this case to make that sort of determination?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and are you familiar with Corporal Hinton's opinion with regards to longitudinal acceleration as it relates to how hard the defendant was braking in this case?
As I say here, I don't have a recollection of his exact wording on it.
Okay. Did you have the opportunity to come to an opinion with regards to that, or were you more focused on just the human factors aspects of this case?
So I was not engaged in attempting to characterize the braking maneuver. That's just not an analysis I conducted.
Okay. And with regards to some of the other things that you mentioned, so when we're looking at the slide, and I don't remember which number this is, but that characterizes braking for 774 feet. And your last slide, which indicates braking for over 5 seconds. Just to clarify for the record, we don't know if that was hovering over the brake or slamming on the brake the entire time necessarily.
So ultimately, we can say it's not hovering over the brake because we do see slowing recorded in the EDR. So there is definitely braking that's occurring. It's just I'm not characterizing the braking intensity during that event because we see braking is occurring.
Okay. And you also discussed glance timeframes. I want to move to that slide as well.
That would be 15, sir.
Thank you.
I just happen to have it in front of me.
Could you flip to 15, if you don't mind? I appreciate that. So these are examples of average glance durations. Did you review any evidence in this case to indicate that the defendant was looking at the instrument panel or through either of his rear or side mirrors?
I'm not aware of anything that tells us that how long any glance would occur or when any glance occurred. I just understand from that he did report glancing down to the speedometer.
Okay. He reported that. Do you know who he reported that to? Was that to you?
That's just information I have from his counsel, sir.
Okay. Did you see that in your review of the traffic homicide investigation report?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. Let's see. Now I want to talk about the Tesla Model S Plaid. Are you familiar with when that particular model was released by Tesla?
As I see here, I don't have the data in front of me, but I believe it was that year, so 21.
Okay, and when it was released, are you familiar with how it was marketed or whether its high acceleration was part of sort of the marketing strategy with regards to its release?
I don't have any kind of specific analyses of the marketing of the vehicle.
So are you familiar with it being released as the car that was, quote, the fastest in the world or with the fastest acceleration?
I'm aware that Tesla marketed the vehicle as a performance package. As far as their exact wording, as I sit here, that's just not part of my analysis.
But it wasn't marketed like a Toyota would have been, right?
Well, sir, it depends on the Toyota, and also beyond that, like I said, it's not part of the analysis.
Okay. And you also mentioned that, or you took into consideration how in this case, this car was started from a stop and that in those initial seconds of acceleration, it hadn't been driven at all, right?
So ultimately, we have data that helps us understand the vehicle did start from a stop. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, that's what I'm trying to portray.
And you also discussed a lot about how that sort of acceleration might be, and this wasn't necessarily your words, but shocking to somebody who hadn't felt that initially, right?
I would generally agree with that, yes.
But you are familiar with the fact that that wasn't the first time the defendant's foot touched the pedal of that accelerator that night.
That's beyond the analysis that I'm conducting. My analysis is simply for that run that led up to the speed and ultimately this collision event.
Okay, so it wasn't something you took into your human factors consideration today that the defendant had actually driven that car before he accelerated on that strip of property?
Ultimately, my analysis is limited to, in effect, the run to over 100 miles per hour.
And you indicated that part of your analysis as well, that it didn't appear as if he was panic braking in the beginning of those 5 seconds.
What I would state is I've not done an in-depth evaluation of the nature of the braking. Again, as I discussed earlier, my analysis is to provide more context to the analysis of Master Corporal Hinton, so understanding what that vehicle was doing before it had got to what's recorded in EDR Event 1.
Were there any parts, and if this wasn't part of your analysis, let me know as well, were there any parts of that 5 seconds that you would say may have been consistent with panic braking?
You're asking me on the fly, but we do see that stability control was engaged for the entirety of the event. So that's telling. Also, we see an occasion towards the end of the event where ABS winds up getting activated. So, but ultimately, I've not performed an in-depth analysis of it. You're getting it off of the fly.
But generally, could the moment when ABS is activated, could that in some circumstances be indicative of panic braking?
It would, but it's not necessarily the limiting factor. So we can say things that occur without the activation of ABS are also panic braking events.
Moment to confer, Your Honor. Nothing further. Thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Chair?
No, Your Honor, no further questions?
You mind if I just ask a couple of questions?
No, that's fine.
So you're not tracking this vehicle, obviously, from the time that it started. This is just from the last 0 up to 124.
So if I understand your question correctly, Judge, it's only starting from where it starts this last run?
Right.
That, yes, Your Honor.
So you have no clue as to how fast the car was driving up to the point where it stopped and then accelerated?
That's correct. That's outside of the analysis I've conducted.
Okay. And when you say the stability versus ABS, ABS is a sign of panic braking
Yes, ABS activation can be a sign of panic braking.
or cannot?
Can.
Okay, so,
So if you see ABS activation, especially in a scenario where there's an attempt to drop a large amount of speed, it's typically indicative of panic braking.
okay. And stability, what does that mean when you say stability versus ABS?
Stability is referring to electronic stability control. That's a system that monitors basically the speed at each wheel of the vehicle, and to provide a simple response or simple explanation, it is there to make sure that the vehicle is going and heading in a direction that you are intending the vehicle to go. So it's trying to make sure that the vehicle's going where you're telling the wheel to take the vehicle.
So there's no significance in the stability in and of itself?
In this case, we see that it's active, so it's intervening to help maintain control over the vehicle.
All right, I don't have any more questions.
Thank you, I have no further questions.
Anything further?
Nothing from the state.
Okay. Can Dr. Morgan be excused?
Yes, Your Honor, I have no
Yes,
further questions.
excused? Yeah. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Judge.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would like to call Master Corporal Robert Hinton, and then
Okay.
we'll get to the character.
Okay.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Corporal.
Good afternoon.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Sure.
Good afternoon. Corporal, can you please introduce yourself to the court, spelling your first and last name for the record?
My name is Corporal Robert Hinton, Hinton,
Okay, and where do you work?
with the Florida Highway Patrol.
Okay, and how long have you been with the Florida Highway Patrol?
I'm on my 27th year.
Okay, and do you have any particular titles or roles within FHP?
I'm currently with what they call the FLAIR team, the Florida Advanced Investigation and Reconstruction Team. I handle high-profile traffic crash investigations.
And how long have you been part of the FLAIR team?
Going on 6 years.
And what, can you give the court a brief sort of rundown as to what the FLAIR team is involved with?
Like I said, we handle a lot of high-profile, complex traffic crash investigations. We handle a lot of the major investigations on interstates that you see involving smoke and fog, where there's multiple vehicles. I've worked crashes involving sometimes up to 50, 60 vehicles with multiple fatalities. So the complexity crashes are what we handle. We handle a lot of what they refer to as high profile, which means you get probably national attention to.
Okay. And what sort of training did you have to undergo in order to be involved with that team, with FHP?
Well, my experience, I've been in traffic homicide for 17, 18 years now. I've investigated over 500 traffic fatalities in my career. I've probably been present at and assisted with well over 1,000 traffic homicide investigations in my career.
And you mentioned earlier reconstruction. What training do you have with regards to accident reconstruction?
I have hundreds of hours of advanced traffic crash investigation, reconstruction, motorcycle crash investigation, pedestrian crash investigation. I have a pretty thick book of certificates that I've achieved over my 18 years as a traffic homicide investigator.
And what is accident reconstruction?
It's actually in layman's term, we answer the who, what, when, why, and where a traffic crash occurs and what causes it, how it happens. We answer all the questions to the crash.
So before you're able to answer that who, what, when, where, and how an accident occurred, what sort of evidence do you need to collect to come to those determinations?
All the evidence that you can possibly obtain during that investigation. Anything pertinent to that crash you want to obtain and analyze with reference to that traffic crash reconstruction investigation.
Okay, so what sort of things do you look for on scene before you do sort of the after work?
Well, the scene is obviously where the physical evidence lies. That's where we look for. We're looking for roadway surface marks. We're looking at the damage to the vehicles, debris fields. We're looking at the occupants of the vehicles, the drivers. We're establishing sobriety, everything like that with the drivers of the vehicles. So we're looking at the totality of circumstances with that crash scene.
Okay, and in addition to the on-scene evidence, are you familiar with event data recorders?
I am.
Okay, what is we've heard what an event data recorder is, but what sort of training do you have with regards to pulling that information and interpreting that information?
I've been certified as the EDR technician, where I can download extract the files from the EDR from the vehicles. And I've also been to the analysis certification class, where I'm certified to analyze the event data recorder information.
Okay. And how do event data recorder sort of data help inform your determination of, or inform your conclusions in accident reconstruction cases?
Well, not to be redundant of what the expert before me basically gave a rundown of what it is, what the EDR does. It gives a lot of information. It gives pertinent information what the vehicle's doing with regards to the speeds, the braking, everything within seconds of the crash. Gives you information at the time of the crash, and in some circumstances gives you information post-crash. So in this circumstance, it's giving you information 5 seconds leading up to the crash.
Okay. And in addition, sorry to cut you off, did you have anything else to add?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And in addition to looking at the physical evidence, looking at the electronic data recorder, do you also rely on interviews conducted by yourself as well as other officers of witnesses and victims to determine what happens in a crash?
Yes, sir, we do.
Okay. Now I want to jump to why you're here in this case. Do you recall your investigation into the State versus Von Mongan?
I do.
Okay. And why, or when were you initially called to investigate that case?
I believe it was a day or two after the initial crash had occurred. Our team took over the investigation. The FLAIR team took over the investigation.
Okay, when your team took over the investigation, did you have the opportunity to review all of the other videos, photos, or interviews taken by the initially responding officers?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. And what was sort of your first step in investigating this crash? Did you go to the scene?
I went to the scene.
Okay. What were you going to look for at the scene, and how far after the accident did you go look for it?
Well, when I went to the scene, I actually, I'm going to review what information I have obtained from the initial investigators that were on scene, that did the on-scene investigation. I got a briefing from them prior to my arrival at the scene, so I had a basic understanding of how the crash occurred and what evidence they observed while on scene. So I went to observe it for myself to see if there was anything that they may have missed or something that was overlooked. So that's basically what I look for when I go to the scene.
Okay. So I want to start with what you know about the scene and the conditions on the night of the crash. Do you know what the lighting was like at the time of the crash?
It was dark.
Okay, do you know if there's any street lighting on that particular road?
There's no street lighting on that road.
What is the speed limit on that road?
30 miles per hour.
And is there a stop sign at the end of the road?
Yes, sir. It's a T intersection. There's a stop sign for Manning Drive at Hermosa.
Okay. And do you know if there was anything visually obstructing that stop sign from the south end of the road that the accident or the crash began on?
No.
Okay. Did you review any evidence to conclude that any roadway or traffic control issues contributed to the cause of the crash in this case?
Yes, there was no contributing factors with regards to the road or traffic control issues.
Okay. And then what about mechanical issues with the particular Tesla involved? Are you familiar with any recalls regarding any mechanical issues?
As part of the investigation, we do check for recalls. There was no active recalls with the vehicle. Again, I checked at a later date to see if anything else came up, and there was never a recall on that vehicle.
Okay, and did you see any evidence to indicate that there were mechanical issues with this particular car that may have contributed to the cause of the crash?
No, there was nothing to lead us to believe that there was any mechanical issues with the vehicle itself.
Okay, now I want to talk about what sort of vehicle was involved. What car was the defendant driving when he got in this crash?
It was the Tesla Plaid.
Okay, do you know when that car was released to the public?
The same year as the crash, 2021.
And what did you know about the car, how it was marketed with regards to its speed or acceleration?
Well, outside of my job as being a crash reconstructionist, knowing so I'm also a car enthusiast, so I was aware of what the Tesla Plaid was, and I know that there was a lot of articles, a lot of stuff through social media about the car, and I know it was put out as the fastest car. I believe Elon Musk made the statement that it's the fastest production car on the road.
Okay. So moving now to the interviews of the defendants and the victim, do you know how the defendant sort of came into control of the car that evening?
Yes, we learned actually through video from the Tesla itself, which basically painted the picture of the whole, all the events leading up to the crash, what had occurred, and later doing witness interviews with the passengers of the vehicle, we learned that the owner of the Tesla, one of the victims, had driven the car. He owned the car and drove it to the defendant's house, where they looked at the vehicle and then went on to drive the vehicle.
Okay, so when you say went on to drive the vehicle, who drove the vehicle once it left the defendant's home?
The defendant.
Okay, and did they drive straight to the location where this crash occurred?
Yes.
Okay. Would you recognize a map of that route if I showed it to you?
Yes.
May I vote to witness, Your Honor?
Sure.
The record reflect, I'm showing defense and then the witness what's been pre-marked. States Exhibit 4 for identification. Thank you, sir. I just handed you what's been pre-marked as States Exhibit 4. Does that show the route of travel that we were just discussing?
Yes.
And does what's reflected on that map accurately reflect the roads and the route that would have been taken that night?
That's correct.
At this time, the state moves to admit what's been pre-marked as States Exhibit 4.
Any objection?
No.
Received.
And the witness step down and better view the
Of course.
television, Your Honor.
I can see it.
Okay. So this shows sort of a route between 2 points. I'm pointing to the location on the far left side. Is that, what's that location indicate?
That would be where they began from to head to the location where the crash occurred.
Okay. So the location on the far side of the map, the far right side of the map, is that where the crash occurred?
Yes.
Okay, so it's at the end of this long strip of road. Is that the strip of road that the video reflects the defendant accelerating quickly down?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk about the roads in between the defendant's home and the site of the crash. What's this long road here?
That's a state road, Curlew Road.
Okay, and then it looks like the route would have turned left or north onto another road. What road's that?
That's County Road 1.
Now, talking about Curlew Road, do you know what the speed limit is on that road?
I believe it's 45 in that area.
Okay. Do you know what the speed limit on this area of County Road 1 is?
I believe it's 35 on County Road 1.
Do both of those have higher speed limits than the area that was used as the sort of the acceleration point before the crash?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and Curlew Road, is it a residential road or is it a busier road?
Well, it's a state road. It's a main artery that travels east-west in Pinellas County.
Okay. And the road that the acceleration happened on, is that a similar state road or is that a residential area?
That's a residential roadway.
Okay. Is the lighting much darker or lighter than Curlew Road and County Road 1?
Like I said before, there's no street lighting on the residential roadway there.
Okay. Now, on this point, at the defendant's home, based on your review of all of the videos, who got in the driver's seat to drive the vehicle at that point?
The defendant.
Okay, did anybody, from your review of the videos, change seats or get in and out of the car? Did the car come to a stop between that point and the point at which the acceleration began?
No, other than stopping at a red light.
Now, based off of your review of the interviews and your personal interviews with the other individuals in the car, did anybody in those moments leading up to the crash express any concern with how fast the defendant was driving?
Yes, upon my interviewing the occupants of the vehicle, the passengers of the vehicles, each one of them made statements that they were yelling at him to stop or slow down or something on that line.
Okay. Now, we discussed briefly, and we're going to see the video here in a few moments, but we discussed briefly the stop sign at the end of Manning Road where it hits Hermosa Drive. Based on your review of the video, were you able to see that stop sign from the point at which the car was stopped before it began accelerating?
Yes, sir.
And did anybody in the car, anybody else in the vehicle indicate that they also saw the stop sign?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And based off of all of the interviews, are you familiar with whether or not the defendant himself had ever been on that particular road?
One of the occupants did make the statement that the defendant informed him that he drove his bicycle to that location and made a general statement that the roadway is smooth in that location.
Okay, do you know if that had anything to do, or do you know if the defendant had indicated if that had anything to do with why they went to that particular location? And it's okay if you don't know the full.
I don't know that.
Okay. But nonetheless, the defendant had told another occupant of the vehicle that he'd been to that location before?
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to talk about the physical evidence that you saw there at the crash. Did you review a crash diagram that sort of helped you put all of this into context?
I prepared the crash diagram based on information that was obtained at the scene. When they mapped the scene, I utilized the mapping information to prepare a scale diagram of the crash scene.
Okay. Would you recognize if I showed it to you?
Yes.
Record reflect, I'm approaching the defense, bullets been pre-marked to State's Exhibit 3. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Is that the crash diagram we were just discussing?
Yes, sir.
And has that diagram been changed or altered in any way since it was created during this investigation?
No, sir.
At this time, the state moves that goes from pre-marked to State's Exhibit 3 in evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Received.
Commissioner Pelley.
Yes.
And Corporal, if I could actually have you step down over here so you can use your finger to identify the different portions of this diagram. I want to start at the bottom here where there's a car next to what's indicated as a stop sign. Can you go ahead and walk the court through what's going on in this part of the diagram?
Okay. Like we discussed before, and the witness that testified before me, the acceleration began quite down the road, about 1,600 feet before this. So this is actually depicting where the intersection stop bar, the stop sign, they would proceed across Hermosa Drive. And you can see the skid marks here, what we call ABS skid marks. There was no indication of any skid marks prior to that. There was no visible marks or physical evidence that was located at the scene to indicate any braking at all at that point. And this is where the embankment begins, and this would refer to up here as the top of the embankment. And this is where you would begin to go airborne. And this is a fence at the back of the property. And if you move on up here, the vehicle proceeds through the backyard of the property and collides into the rear of the residence. And this would be the final rest location. And one of the victims that was in the house came to rest outside the front of the residence.
Okay, so I want to back up and sort of start from the beginning as we walk through everything. So you mentioned that these marks here that are labeled as A, you indicated those were ABS skid marks. Can you explain to the court what that means?
Yes, like we heard before, the ABS is anti-lock braking. It keeps the wheels from locking up. In older vehicles, when you apply the brakes and go into hard braking, the wheels would lock up and it would leave a real thick black skid mark. The braking system in today's cars, they keep the wheel from locking up 100%. It's like intermittent locking of the brakes. They still leave a mark on the roadway, what we refer to as ABS marks. It's a lot thinner skid mark, and they're harder to locate, and they're very short-lived. If you don't really collect them at the night of the crash, they tend to disappear. I went 2 days later, and they were no longer visible, so the investigators at the scene were able to see them, and they were able to capture them with photographs.
Okay, so at any point during that entire road leading up to where we began seeing those ABS skid marks, did anybody the night of the scene or any photographs or any videos indicate ABS skid marks before that point?
No, the roadway was closely examined that night to look for skid marks or any evidence of braking, and that's what was notated here. These were mapped exactly where the marks were observed at the beginning point and end point at the bottom of the embankment.
And for record purposes, do those begin before or after the vehicle that the defendant was driving passed the stop sign in this case?
After the stop.
Okay, and about how far had that vehicle traveled before we see those ABS skid marks from the hard braking?
Or to travel across the
From where it started at 0 to when it came to rest? How far did it travel before we see the skid marks get made?
It was, like we said before, it's about 1,600 feet from the initial start of the acceleration.
You got it, Nancy, thank you. In addition to the physical evidence, did you have the opportunity to review the event data recorder information in this case as it relates to the defendant braking?
I did. I reviewed and analyzed the event data report from the Tesla.
Okay, and we heard the defense expert go through a lot of the details of that event data recorder, generally with regards to speed and when they began applying brakes. Do you disagree with anything?
No, everything that the expert witness for the defense was right on with what my analysis was.
Okay, and you were in the courtroom, so you heard me ask him whether or not he had, you heard me ask about when the event data recorder begins to say the brakes were activated. So to clarify with you, does that in any way, looking at it on its own, indicate how hard the defendant had been braking?
No, we just know that there was enough pressure on the brake pedal itself to activate the status to on the brake. That doesn't necessarily mean that he was in hard braking at the point. The ABS braking that we were describing that occurred approximately 0.8 of a second prior to the event or impact with the embankment was the only indication that the vehicle was in hard braking at that time, in panic braking.
Okay, that's the only physical indication, but did you review anything else? Did you review the longitudinal acceleration data from the event data recorder?
I did.
Okay, now what is longitudinal acceleration for the court?
Well, in layman's term, the acceleration, a lot of people understand that acceleration is taking off from a stop and taking off, but in the reconstruction world, acceleration is also deceleration. So in this aspect, on the EDR report, it's referred to in a negative number. So when you see the negative number, it's referring that the vehicle is in fact decelerating instead of accelerating. So the longitudinal acceleration in a negative number is actually displaying deceleration at that time.
Okay, so when you see a longitudinal acceleration with a negative number, is that just sort of a long technical way to say the car was slowing down?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, what did you notice about the longitudinal acceleration in those 5 seconds leading up to the contact with the embankment that informed your opinion as to whether or not or when the defendant began hard braking?
It displayed, one, it showed the speed decreasing, which in itself was decreasing slowly. So that in itself told me that the vehicle was not in hard braking at the time. It also showed, as we explained before, the G's within the acceleration, and they were very low at that point. And it wasn't until we got into the hard braking, which was at the 0.7, like that was discussed earlier, which is very hard braking.
Okay, so once you see the hard braking, how far or how close to that point of